You never wanted me to be traumatized. I was traumatized the moment I walked in the room and see my mom lying there. And I was even more traumatized. I couldn't even hold her with her last breath.
A woman spends years building a business from nothing. One client at a time. One haircut at a time. One dream at a time. She becomes more than a hairstylist. She becomes a mentor, a mother, a grandmother, a successful salon owner respected throughout her community. One October night, she is found dying on the floor of her own bedroom. The man who admits pulling the trigger isn't arrested. He isn't handcuffed. He isn't charged. Instead, he walks free. Police initially believe his story. He says he had no choice. He says she came after him with a knife. He says he acted in self-defense. For Amanda Williams' family, none of it made sense. If this was truly self-defense, why were there so many unanswered questions? Why did the forensic evidence seem to tell a completely different story? And why would it take a public campaign before prosecutors finally charged the man who admitted shooting her? What began as an apparent closed case would become one of Northeast Ohio's most controversial homicide investigations. A case where cell phone videos, medical science, crime scene reconstruction, and one devastating autopsy would slowly dismantle a story investigators initially accepted. This is the Amanda Williams case. Before we begin, if you enjoy carefully researched true crime documentaries built around verified evidence, courtroom testimony, and forensic analysis rather than sensational rumors, make sure you subscribe. New cases are released regularly, and your support helps this channel continue producing in-depth investigations. After watching, let us know your thoughts in the comments. At what point do you think investigators realized this wasn't the self-defense case it first appeared to be? October 9th, 2023. Warrensville Heights, a suburb just outside Cleveland, Ohio. The neighborhood is quiet. Most families have settled in for the night. Inside one home, however, an argument has been building. We don't know every word exchanged between Amanda Williams and her fiancé, Terrell Edwards. What we do know comes from evidence presented later in court: cell phone recordings, physical evidence, forensic testimony, and the statements both sides would eventually make before a jury. Those pieces, assembled over months, would paint a picture far more complex than the one investigators first heard. But before any of that, before the courtroom, before the indictment, before the conviction, there was Amanda. Friends didn't describe her by the way she died. They described the way she lived. Amanda Williams was 46 years old. She wasn't someone waiting for opportunity. She created it. Working as a professional hairstylist, she slowly built a loyal clientele through years of dedication. In an industry where reputation means everything, clients return not only because of her skill, but because of who she was. For many, a salon appointment wasn't simply about getting their hair done. It was about conversation, encouragement, friendship. Amanda became part of people's lives. Eventually, she opened her own salon in nearby University Heights. Owning a business is never easy. Success doesn't happen overnight. Long hours, financial risks, competition. Every new client had to be earned. Every month required determination. Yet Amanda succeeded. Outside of work, she was a devoted mother. Later, she became a grandmother. Her family remembers someone who always seemed to be helping someone else before thinking about herself. She was active in her church community. People who knew her consistently described her as compassionate, driven, and deeply connected to those around her. To them, Amanda wasn't simply another homicide victim. She was the person everyone called when they needed advice, or comfort, or simply someone willing to listen, which made the events of October 9th almost impossible for those closest to her to understand. Because the person accused of taking her life wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a burglar. It wasn't someone who broke into her home. It was the man she had planned to marry, Terrell Edwards. Their relationship had lasted several years. Like many relationships, it wasn't perfect. But exactly how troubled it had become wouldn't fully emerge until prosecutors began digging through years of messages, videos, and evidence. Initially, however, investigators were focused on only one question: what happened inside that bedroom? The first version of events came from the only surviving witness, Edwards. According to him, Amanda had armed herself with a butcher knife. He claimed she cornered him. He claimed he feared she was about to stab him. Unable to escape, he said he reached beneath a mattress, grabbed a handgun, and fired to save his own life. It's a story investigators hear more often than many people realize. Self-defense cases are among the most difficult to investigate because the physical evidence can sometimes support more than one explanation. A person can legally use deadly force under certain circumstances if they reasonably believe they are in imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm. The burden falls on investigators to determine whether the evidence supports or contradicts that claim. In the hours immediately following Amanda's death, police had one deceased victim, one surviving shooter, and one explanation. At that moment, they apparently lacked enough evidence to prove the shooting was a crime rather than lawful self-defense. Within approximately 48 hours, Edwards was released. No charges, no murder indictment, no trial date. For Amanda's family, the decision was devastating. To them, it felt as though the investigation had ended before it had truly begun. They couldn't reconcile the woman they knew with the official explanation. Questions kept piling up. Too many questions. If Amanda was attacking him, why did aspects of the physical evidence seem inconsistent? Were investigators overlooking something? Or had they simply not yet uncovered everything that happened inside that bedroom? What Amanda's family didn't know at the time was that the answers were already waiting. Hidden inside digital evidence. Hidden inside forensic pathology. Hidden inside tiny details that would become impossible to ignore once investigators looked closer. Sometimes a homicide investigation changes because a witness comes forward. Sometimes someone confesses. And sometimes the evidence never changes. Only the way investigators understand it. In Amanda Williams' case, that understanding would eventually transform a closed self-defense investigation into a murder prosecution carrying a potential life sentence. Once prosecutors reconstructed the final minutes of Amanda's life, the story told in court would be dramatically different from the one first given to police. The biggest question was no longer whether Terrell Edwards fired the gun. He admitted that from the beginning. The question became, was Amanda Williams the aggressor? Or was she desperately trying to survive? When detectives investigate a homicide involving intimate partners, they don't begin by asking who fired the gun. That answer is often obvious. Instead, they ask a far more difficult question. What was happening in this relationship before the trigger was pulled? Because very rarely does a deadly confrontation begin the night someone dies. More often, it begins months, or even years, earlier. As prosecutors prepared their case against Terrell Edwards, they started retracing the history of his relationship with Amanda Williams. Friends described the couple as affectionate at times. They had built a life together, shared a home, and had plans for the future. To outsiders, they appeared to be working toward marriage. But prosecutors would later argue that behind closed doors, the relationship wasn't nearly as stable as it appeared. One of the most significant discoveries wasn't hidden inside a police report. It was hidden inside old text messages. Messages neither Amanda nor Terrell could have imagined would one day be projected onto a courtroom screen. Years before Amanda's death, Edwards had sent Amanda an apology. Not for forgetting an anniversary, not for an argument, but for physically hurting her. According to evidence introduced at trial, he admitted kicking Amanda in the face during an earlier confrontation. The apology became one of the prosecution's strongest pieces of evidence, not because it proved murder, but because it challenged Edwards' credibility. During his testimony, Edwards denied ever abusing Amanda physically. The prosecution confronted him with his own words. Those messages suggested something very different. The jury now had to decide which version they believed. The man on the witness stand, or the man who had written those texts years earlier. Domestic violence experts often explain that abusive relationships rarely follow a straight line. Periods of conflict are frequently followed by apologies, promises, reconciliation, hope that things will improve. Those cycles can make it incredibly difficult for victims to leave permanently. It's important to note that only Amanda and Terrell truly knew everything that happened throughout their relationship. The jury wasn't asked to decide whether every argument had been abusive. They were asked to determine whether the evidence surrounding Amanda's death supported Edward's claim of lawful self-defense. Still, those earlier messages provided context. Context that prosecutors believed helped explain the events that unfolded on October 9, 2023. As evening turned into night, tension inside the home continued to build. Exactly what sparked the final argument remains unclear. Neither side disputed that there had been a confrontation. The disagreement centered on what happened next. One detail, however, would become incredibly important. Terrell Edwards didn't just experience the argument. He recorded parts of it. Using a cell phone, he captured several short videos inside the bedroom. At first glance, the recordings appeared to support his version of events. Amanda could be seen holding a knife. For many people, that single image might seem enough to settle the case. A woman holding a knife. A man with a gun. Self-defense. Case closed. But investigators learned something that every experienced homicide detective understands. Pictures tell stories. Videos tell stories. But neither always tells the whole story. The recordings captured Amanda holding what appeared to be a kitchen knife. At one point, Edwards can be heard asking what she was doing. Amanda responds that she is defending herself. Those few words would become some of the most discussed evidence during the trial. Notice what she did not say. She didn't say she planned to attack him. She didn't threaten to kill him in the recording presented at trial. Instead, prosecutors argued her words suggested something entirely different, that she believed she needed protection. Defense attorneys viewed the same recording differently. To them, Amanda's possession of the knife demonstrated that Edwards faced an immediate threat. The exact same piece of evidence, two completely different interpretations. That would become the central battle of the trial. The videos also revealed something else. Time. Instead of documenting one sudden explosion of violence, the recordings showed several minutes passing before the shooting occurred. That timeline became extremely important. If someone truly fears they're about to be killed, events usually unfold in seconds. But investigators believe these recordings suggested there were opportunities for decisions to be made. Opportunities that would later become central to the prosecution's argument that deadly force was unnecessary. The jury carefully watched those recordings. Again, and again, and again. Not looking only at Amanda, but watching Edwards. Listening to his tone, his movements, his responses. Sometimes what isn't said carries just as much weight as what is. Then, the recording stopped. No camera captured the shooting itself. No witness stood inside the room. The only account came from Edwards. According to his testimony, Amanda advanced toward him with a knife. He claimed he feared she was about to stab him. He said he retrieved a handgun stored beneath the mattress. Then he fired. Multiple times. The gunfire echoed through the home. Silence followed. Moments later. Amanda Williams lay mortally wounded. After the shooting, Edwards called 911. During the emergency call, he admitted he had shot his fiancé. He maintained that he had acted in self-defense. Emergency responders rushed to the residence. Officers entered carefully, unsure whether the danger had ended. Inside the bedroom, they found Amanda suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. Despite life-saving efforts, she would later be pronounced dead. The scene was secured. Crime scene investigators began documenting every inch of the room. Every bullet casing. Every bloodstain. Every photograph. Every measurement. At the time, investigators could not know that tiny details collected that night would eventually dismantle the original narrative. Because crime scenes don't speak immediately. Sometimes, they whisper. And investigators only hear the message after weeks of careful analysis. Outside the home, Amanda's family was only beginning to understand what had happened. Phone calls spread quickly. Shock turned into grief. Grief turned into confusion. Then confusion turned into anger. How could someone admit shooting another person, yet be released without charges only days later? To many in the community, the answer made no sense. But prosecutors would later explain that homicide investigations don't end when officers leave the scene. Sometimes they are only beginning. Every phone must be examined. Every forensic report completed. Every autopsy finished. Every witness interviewed. And every statement tested against the physical evidence. As more information arrived, investigators started noticing inconsistencies. Small ones at first, then larger ones, until eventually, the evidence no longer fit the story they had originally been told. The case that once appeared headed toward closure was quietly reopening. The family's determination also ensured the case stayed in the public eye. They organized, spoke to the media, and demanded that investigators continue digging deeper rather than accepting the initial conclusion. What they didn't yet know was that science, not public opinion, would ultimately become the deciding factor. The medical examiner's findings, ballistics, blood evidence, the placement of a knife, and even sounds captured on a cell phone recording. Together, they would reshape the investigation. The question was no longer simply who fired the gun. Everyone already knew that. The question became whether the physical evidence proved Amanda Williams had been attacking Terrell Edwards, or whether it proved something far more tragic. In homicide investigations, the dead cannot testify, but sometimes their injuries do. And in Amanda Williams' case, the autopsy would tell investigators a story that no witness could. One that would eventually convince a grand jury to indict Terrell Edwards for murder. In every homicide investigation, there comes a moment when detectives stop asking people what happened and start asking the evidence. Because people can lie, people can forget, people can exaggerate. But bloodstains, bullet trajectories, autopsy findings, and digital evidence tell their own story. They don't care who is crying. They don't care who seems believable. They only reveal what the physical evidence can support. In Amanda Williams' case, investigators had already heard Terrell Edwards' version of events. Now it was time to test that version against science. Little by little, the pieces began falling into place. And each new discovery raised another difficult question. The first major piece of evidence was Amanda's autopsy. Performed by the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office, the examination documented the devastating injuries she suffered during the shooting. Amanda had been struck by 6 bullets. Several wounds were serious, but one, in particular, became central to the prosecution's case. A gunshot had severely injured her spinal cord. According to the medical examiner's testimony at trial, that injury would have caused immediate and catastrophic paralysis. The prosecution argued this finding was inconsistent with Edwards' account that Amanda continued posing an imminent threat after being shot. The defense, however, maintained that Edwards fired because he believed he was facing an immediate attack at the moment he used deadly force. That distinction mattered. Under Ohio law, the legal question was not simply how Amanda died, but whether Edwards reasonably believed deadly force was necessary when he fired. The jury would ultimately have to weigh the medical evidence alongside all of the other facts. Investigators next turned their attention to the bedroom itself. Crime scene photographs documented the location of every significant piece of evidence. Nothing was too small. Nothing was ignored. Among the most important items was the knife. Edwards had consistently maintained that Amanda confronted him with it. Investigators did recover a knife at the scene, but its location and the surrounding evidence became a subject of intense scrutiny. Prosecutors argued that the physical evidence did not support the sequence of events Edwards described. The defense disagreed, arguing that the knife corroborated his account that Amanda had armed herself. Because no one else witnessed the confrontation, the jury had to decide which interpretation of the evidence was more credible. Then investigators reviewed Edwards' cell phone again. This time, they weren't focused only on what the video showed. They were listening. Modern smartphones capture more than images. They capture voices, footsteps, doors opening, objects striking the floor, tiny sounds most people never notice. Investigators carefully analyzed the recordings. Prosecutors later argued that one sound in particular was significant. They suggested it was consistent with an object sliding across the floor. The prosecution contended this supported their theory that the knife had been moved after the shooting. The defense rejected that interpretation and argued the recordings did not establish that the scene had been altered. Ultimately, it was for the jury to determine how much weight, if any, to give that evidence. Investigators also examined the timing of the videos. The recordings documented several minutes leading up to the shooting. That timeline became critically important. The prosecution argued that the recordings showed the confrontation unfolding over several minutes rather than in one instantaneous life-or-death struggle. They contended this undermined the claim that Edwards had no alternative but to use deadly force. The defense countered that a dangerous situation can escalate rapidly even after a period of argument. Again, the same evidence, two competing interpretations. As detectives assembled these findings, they revisited Edwards' statements to police. One of the most important principles in homicide investigations is consistency. If someone's account remains consistent with the physical evidence, investigators often gain confidence in that statement. But when significant conflicts emerge, investigators begin asking why. Prosecutors argued that Edwards' description of the shooting did not align with key forensic findings. His attorneys insisted that his account remained truthful and that the evidence was being interpreted unfairly. The disagreement would eventually play out before a jury rather than investigators. Meanwhile, Amanda's family refused to let the case disappear from public attention. For them, the initial decision to release Edwards remained almost impossible to accept. They attended meetings with prosecutors. They spoke publicly. Friends, relatives, church members, and supporters continued calling for accountability. It is important to understand, however, that public pressure alone does not determine whether criminal charges are filed. Prosecutors must believe the available evidence establishes probable cause and supports the charges under the law. As additional forensic analysis, witness interviews, and digital evidence were reviewed, prosecutors concluded the case had changed. The investigation was no longer where it had been 48 hours after the shooting. It had become something much larger. On November 1, 2023, a Cuyahoga County grand jury returned an indictment. Terrell Edwards was charged with aggravated murder, felonious assault, and domestic violence. The decision marked a dramatic turning point. Just weeks earlier, he had walked free after telling police he acted in self-defense. Now, he faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The indictment also sent a powerful message. Investigations do not always end with an officer's first impression of a crime scene. As new evidence emerges, cases can change, sometimes dramatically. Preparing for trial would take months. Both sides assembled experts. Both sides reviewed forensic reports. Both sides prepared witnesses. The prosecution believed science would expose a fabricated self-defense claim. The defense believed the prosecution was second-guessing a split-second decision made during a frightening confrontation. Neither side disputed one basic fact. Terrell Edwards fired the shots that killed Amanda Williams. The real battle would center on why he fired them. Was he a frightened man defending himself? Or was Amanda Williams the victim of an intentional killing that was later explained away as self-defense? Inside the courtroom, 12 jurors would hear every recording, study every photograph, listen to every expert, and ultimately decide which story the evidence supported. Because, in criminal court, it's not enough for one version to sound convincing. It has to withstand the scrutiny of science. And as the trial began, both the prosecution and the defense knew that every word, every exhibit, and every witness could determine whether Terrell Edwards walked free or spent the rest of his life behind bars. A courtroom is unlike any other place. It's where emotion collides with evidence, where grief meets procedure, where memories are tested against facts, and where 12 ordinary citizens are asked to make an extraordinary decision. When Terrell Edwards' trial began in early 2024, everyone in the courtroom already knew one thing. Amanda Williams was dead, and Terrell Edwards had admitted that he shot her. The jury's job wasn't to decide who fired the gun. It was to decide whether the law justified it. If Edwards had reasonably believed he faced an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, Ohio law allowed him to argue self-defense. But if the prosecution proved beyond a reasonable doubt that his claim wasn't supported by the evidence, the shooting would not be legally justified. That distinction would shape every witness, every exhibit, and every question asked during the trial. The prosecution began by introducing the jury to Amanda, not simply as a victim, but as a person. They described her as a successful salon owner, a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who had spent years building a business and a life in Northeast Ohio. Family members and loved ones remembered her generosity, her work ethic, and her commitment to those around her. The prosecution's goal was not to appeal to sympathy alone. It was to provide context, to explain who Amanda was before the night her life ended. Then, the focus shifted to the relationship. Jurors were shown text messages from years before the shooting. Among them were messages in which Edwards apologized after acknowledging that he had kicked Amanda in the face during an earlier incident. The prosecution argued these messages contradicted Edwards' testimony that he had never physically abused Amanda. The defense urged jurors to focus on the events of October 9, 2023, arguing that prior relationship issues did not determine what happened during the final confrontation. The judge instructed the jury on the proper legal purpose of such evidence, reminding them that they must decide the case based on all of the admissible evidence presented at trial. Next came the cell phone videos. The courtroom grew quiet. Jurors watched recordings captured inside the bedroom only minutes before the shooting. Amanda could be seen holding a knife. Edwards could be heard speaking to her. Amanda responded that she was defending herself. The prosecution argued those words reflected fear rather than aggression. The defense argued that Amanda's possession of the knife demonstrated the danger Edwards claimed he faced. The same recordings, the same voices, the same images, yet two completely different interpretations. Ultimately, it would be the jury, not the attorneys, who decided what those recordings meant. Then came the forensic experts. Medical testimony is often some of the most technical evidence presented in a homicide trial. But in this case, prosecutors used it to tell a straightforward story. The medical examiner explained Amanda's injuries and described the wound that damaged her spinal cord. According to that testimony, the injury would have caused immediate paralysis. The prosecution argued that this finding conflicted with Edwards' version of events. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation, emphasizing that self-defense must be evaluated based on what Edwards reasonably believed at the moment he fired, not with the benefit of hindsight. This became one of the trial's central legal debates. Investigators also testified about the crime scene. Jurors examined photographs, evidence markers, measurements, the location of the knife. The prosecution argued that the physical evidence did not support the sequence of events Edwards described. The defense maintained that investigators were drawing conclusions that went beyond what the evidence could actually prove. Every piece of forensic evidence became another point of disagreement. Every witness was questioned by both sides. Every conclusion was tested. Then came one of the most anticipated moments of the trial. Terrell Edwards took the witness stand. Testifying in your own defense is always a significant decision. A defendant has the constitutional right to remain silent. But once they choose to testify, prosecutors may question them directly. Edwards repeated his claim. He said he feared for his life. He maintained that Amanda confronted him with a knife. He insisted that he acted in self-defense. During cross-examination, prosecutors confronted him with earlier statements, text messages, and the physical evidence. Their questions focused on the inconsistencies they believed existed between his testimony and the forensic findings. The defense objected at times. The judge ruled on those objections. The questioning continued. By the end of his testimony, the jury had heard directly from the man accused of killing Amanda Williams. Now, they had to decide whether they believed him. After days of testimony, both sides delivered closing arguments. The prosecution argued that Amanda Williams was not attacking Terrell Edwards in the way he claimed. They told jurors that the physical evidence, the cell phone recordings, and the medical testimony all pointed to the same conclusion, that the self-defense claim was not supported by the evidence. The defense urged jurors to remember the high burden of proof in a criminal case. They argued that if the evidence left any reasonable doubt about whether Edwards acted in self-defense, the law required a verdict in his favor. Two competing narratives. One jury. One decision. The jurors retired to deliberate. Behind closed doors, they reviewed the evidence. The videos. The testimony. The forensic reports. The text messages. The law. Every exhibit. Every argument. Every question. Outside the jury room, Amanda's family waited. So did Edward's family. For both families, the outcome would change their lives forever. On March 4, 2024, the jury returned to the courtroom. The clerk stood. The verdict forms were handed to the judge. One by one, the verdicts were read aloud. Not guilty of aggravated murder, but guilty of murder. Guilty of a second count of murder. Guilty of 2 counts of felonious assault. Guilty of domestic violence. Most importantly, the jury rejected Terrell Edwards' claim that the shooting was legally justified as self-defense. For Amanda's family, it was a moment of profound emotion. More than a year earlier, they had watched the man who admitted shooting Amanda walk out of custody without charges. Now, after months of investigation and a public trial, a jury had reached a very different conclusion. Justice, as defined by the criminal courts, had finally been served. But for Amanda's loved ones, no verdict could bring her back. No prison sentence could restore the years she should have had with her children, her grandchild, her friends, or the clients who had become like family. The verdict ended the trial. It did not end the loss. 1 week later, Judge Stephen Gall sentenced Terrell Edwards to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 24 years, along with additional penalties related to the firearms specifications. For prosecutors, the sentence reflected the seriousness of the crimes the jury found had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. For the defense, however, the legal fight was not over. Because in the American justice system, a conviction is not always the final chapter. Sometimes, another courtroom and another panel of judges has the final word. A guilty verdict doesn't always end a criminal case. In the American justice system, every person convicted of a serious crime has the right to appeal. But an appeal isn't a second trial. No new jury is called. No new witnesses testify. No one returns to the crime scene. Instead, appellate judges ask a different question. Did the trial court make a legal error significant enough to overturn the conviction? That's where Terrell Edwards' case headed next. While Amanda's family tried to rebuild their lives after an emotionally exhausting trial, Edwards' attorneys prepared to challenge the verdict. They argued that mistakes made during the proceedings deprived him of a fair trial. Among the issues raised on appeal were claims involving the admission of evidence, the effectiveness of his legal representation, the prosecutor's conduct during trial, and whether the jury had been properly instructed on the law. Most importantly, the appeal argued that the evidence was insufficient to disprove self-defense. The appellate court's job wasn't to decide whether it personally agreed with the jury. Its responsibility was to determine whether the trial had been conducted according to the law and whether the evidence, viewed under the proper legal standard, supported the convictions. Months passed. Written briefs were filed. Judges reviewed thousands of pages of testimony. Every objection, every ruling, every exhibit, every legal argument. Nothing was rushed. Because when someone has been sentenced to life in prison, every claim deserves careful review. Then, on February 27, 2025, the 8th District Court of Appeals issued its decision. The panel unanimously affirmed Edwards' convictions and sentence. In practical terms, that meant the appellate court found no reversible error requiring a new trial or the overturning of the jury's verdict. For Amanda's family, the decision brought another measure of closure. It confirmed that the conviction would stand. For Edwards, it meant his life sentence remained in effect, with parole eligibility after 24 years. Looking back at the case, it's striking how dramatically the investigation evolved. In the first 48 hours after Amanda's death, the only detailed account investigators had came from the man who admitted pulling the trigger. Based on the information available at that moment, he was released without charges. But investigations are not frozen in time. As additional evidence emerged, prosecutors revisited the case. Digital evidence was analyzed more closely. The autopsy findings were evaluated alongside the physical evidence. Witnesses were interviewed. Past communications were examined. Eventually, investigators concluded that the totality of the evidence supported criminal charges. That sequence serves as an important reminder that early investigative decisions can change when new evidence is uncovered. The case also illustrates the growing role of digital evidence in modern homicide investigations. Years ago, investigators relied heavily on eyewitness testimony. Today, cell phones often become silent witnesses. They record conversations, videos, timestamps, locations, and sometimes, as in this case, recordings made by the people involved become critical pieces of evidence examined in court. Those recordings did not answer every question, but they became part of a larger forensic picture that jurors were asked to consider alongside medical testimony, physical evidence, and witness accounts. Another lesson from Amanda Williams' case is the importance of forensic science. Autopsies are far more than medical procedures. They are detailed examinations that help investigators understand how injuries occurred. Medical examiners don't decide guilt or innocence. Their role is to explain what the injuries reveal. Likewise, crime scene investigators don't tell juries what happened. They document, measure, photograph, collect, preserve. The legal system then asks judges and juries to evaluate that evidence within the framework of the law. In Amanda's case, those scientific findings became central to the prosecution's effort to challenge the self-defense claim. The defense, in turn, argued that the evidence should be interpreted differently. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution, and the appellate court later left that verdict undisturbed. For Amanda's loved ones, however, the legal process was only one part of the story. Behind every court filing, every exhibit, every legal argument, was a family living with an absence that could never truly be filled. A mother who would never again answer a phone call from her children. A grandmother who would miss birthdays and holidays. A business owner whose chair in the salon would remain empty. Clients who once looked forward to their appointments would instead attend memorial services. The legal system can determine responsibility. It cannot restore what was lost. Amanda Williams' story also became a point of conversation within her community about domestic violence and the complexities of intimate partner homicide investigations. Cases involving partners are often among the most challenging for investigators because there may be no surviving independent eyewitnesses. Physical evidence becomes especially important. So, do careful, methodical investigations. This case underscored why investigators continue examining evidence even after an initial decision appears to have been made. As true crime audiences, it's easy to focus on verdicts, on courtroom drama, on forensic breakthroughs. But behind every case file is a real person. Amanda Williams wasn't simply a name in a headline. She was a daughter, a mother, a grandmother, a friend, a salon owner who built her career through years of dedication, and a woman whose life ended inside the home where she should have been safe. Cases like this also remind us that justice is a process, not a single moment. Sometimes that process is swift. Sometimes it takes months. Sometimes the first explanation given to investigators proves accurate. And sometimes, as prosecutors argued happened here, a closer examination of the evidence reveals a very different story. Whatever one's perspective, the jury's verdict and the appellate court's decision now form the legal conclusion of this case. Thank you for watching this documentary. If you appreciate carefully researched true crime stories that focus on verified evidence, forensic science, and courtroom proceedings, not rumors or sensationalism, consider subscribing to the channel. New documentaries are released regularly, covering some of the most compelling criminal investigations from around the world. And now we'd like to hear from you. At what point in this case do you think the investigation truly changed? Was it the cell phone videos? The forensic findings? The earlier text messages? Or was it the decision to keep investigating after the initial release? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. If you found this documentary informative, please leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss future investigations. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, every piece of evidence tells a story. Sometimes, it's the only witness that never changes.